Welcome, everyone, to this SEC Historical Society Isaac Hunt Hall of Honor celebration. There are three important numbers that I'd like to tell you today about this celebration: 90, 25, and 4. 90 years ago, the SEC was created, and 25 years ago, we created the SEC Historical Society to recognize contributions by those in securities regulation over the years. And 4 years ago, this country celebrated its first Juneteenth federal holiday, and it is because of that holiday we wanted to do this recognition of African Americans who've worked in securities regulation and securities and financial services generally, and do this inaugural Hall of Honor. It is in honor of Ike Hunt, who, in addition to being a commissioner and one of the first African Americans to work at the Securities and Exchange Commission in the investment company area, he was also a professor of securities law for over a decade. He led two different law schools as deans, and I can confirm Chairman Arthur Lovett's comments about Commissioner Hunt that, quote, he was the scholarly voice of the commission when we were at the commission table, and, end quote. And the other quotation was that he held the staff to his level of rigor and exactitude, and investors and the staff were much better for it, close quotes. It is these characteristics that I think make Ike Hunt the perfect lead name for the Hall of Honor that we're putting on today. Now, I know some folks have asked me, Ron, why are you Vice President of Development for the SEC Historical Society when they've had only two African American commissioners over their 90-year period? And that's probably a good question. But my answer is that SEC history is as much history as it is personal. It was at the SEC where I received a surprise baby shower. At a time, I didn't know that the fathers actually got a baby shower, and that was given to me by my colleagues. It is also at the SEC where I had a colleague come from the far suburbs of Virginia to Northeast Washington, D.C., to a small funeral home at the death of my father. Those two things are also SEC history. And while I know there is no crystal staircase in many jobs, it is little things like that, the personal and the history, that I think drives my commitment and hopefully the commitment of others to honoring the work of those throughout society. And today, what we do is we're trying to broaden that tapestry, honoring those today in this inaugural year, but throughout the coming years, we will honor African Americans and other people of color throughout our commission's history and recognize their contributions to our SEC history over time. And with that introduction, I'd like to turn it over to Kier so he can begin our program, and I'll return at the end of the program for another quick word or two. Kier, take it away.
Great, Ron. Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. I am truly excited about this program, and I'm honored to be joined by three trailblazers. Let me say a quick word about me. My name is Kier Gums. I'm the General Counsel at Edward Jones, where I lead our legal and compliance teams. But importantly, I started my career at the Securities and Exchange Commission, ironically, at a time when Ike Hunt, our honoree today, was serving as a commissioner. The word trailblazer is used a lot, and this program is about highlighting three trailblazers in the truest sense of the word. And it's appropriate that we have trailblazers that we honor, like Ike Hunt, who was a trailblazer in his own right. Let me set a little bit of context before I introduce the trailblazers that are going to be joining me for this session today. 2 years ago, my good friend and Georgetown law professor, Chris Brummer, shared some staggering statistics regarding the role of diversity in financial regulation. According to his data that was compiled at the time, there had been, by that point, more than 129 heads of major regulatory agencies since the founding of the Federal Reserve in 1913, 129. Two of those were Black at that point in time. And you heard that correctly, just two. Now that number has increased slightly by an additional two, one of whom we're going to talk with today, but that's still not a great statistic. And as Professor Brummer pointed out then, the stakes couldn't be higher. Financial regulation has been critical to the United States economy, and in particular, the experience of African Americans since the panic of 1873 and the failure of the Free Mints Bank, which due to risky investments in railroad companies and real estate, wiped out the first generation of wealth created by the newly freed African Americans. Very, very sobering. So with that, I'd like to introduce the three trailblazers that we're here to talk with today. The first is Paul Roy. Paul, in January of 2022, retired from Capital Research and Management Company, one of the largest asset managers in the world with more than $3.6 trillion under management. Until his retirement, Paul served as a member of the firm's executive committee and the board of directors. He also served as chief legal officer for the American Family of Mutual Funds, which was one of the largest mutual fund complexes in the United States. And he served as a board member and principal executive officer of various American funds, where he coordinated oversight and management of services to the funds. In addition to that, he was a founder of the Capital Associates of African Descent, which was instrumental in advancing Capital's diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. Before joining Capital, Paul served as the director of the Division of Investment Management at the SEC, where he was the first African American to head a major division of the SEC. And during his over 6 years as a director there, he worked with three SEC chairmen, Levitt, Pitt, and Donaldson. He led numerous initiatives to strengthen and enhance the investment management regulatory regime at a critical time in the history of the industry, including strengthening corporate governance for mutual funds, enhancing ethical standards for mutual funds and investment advisors, requiring that funds and advisors adopt comprehensive compliance policies and procedures and designate a chief compliance officer, improving fee disclosure for funds, conflicts of interest, portfolio holdings, and the list goes on and on. Paul, literally, I could spend 30 minutes just talking about your accolades. We're also joined by Richard Humes, who is an Associate General Counsel for the Litigation and Administration Practice for the SEC. Richard served with the commission since 1977. He received the SEC Distinguished Service Award in 1991 and the Presidential Meritorious Executive Award in 1996. After the passage of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, Mr. Humes spearheaded the SEC team that promulgated ethical standards for attorneys who had practiced before the commission on behalf of a public company. Before the Ninth Circuit, he successfully argued for the SEC's broad power under Sarbanes-Oxley to freeze extraordinary payments to company officers that were made when the commission is investigating possible wrongdoing. And last, but certainly not least, we have my good friend and I'm super impressed colleague, Erica Williams, who was appointed as the chair of the PCAOB by the SEC Commission in November 2021 and was recently renominated for that role. Congratulations, Erica. Chair Williams joined the PCAOB from Kirkland & Ellis, where she was a litigation partner. And before that, she was a special assistant and associate counsel to President Barack Obama, where she advised the president and his senior advisors on legal and constitutional issues involving economic policy, financial regulation and reform, financial technology, trade, very long list, Erica, intellectual property, data protection, and privacy. Before that, Chair Williams spent 11 years at the SEC serving as Deputy Chief of Staff for 3 SEC chairs. And in that role, she oversaw all aspects of the SEC's operations and served as a senior legal advisor to the SEC chair on regulatory policy and rulemakings, enforcement, compliance examinations, agency management, and strategy. I am so thrilled to be with the three of you, Paul, Erica, and Richard. Thank you very much for joining us today. So let's start at the beginning, and maybe, Paul, I'll start with you. Tell me a little bit about how you got into the financial services space.
Okay, thank you, Kier. And let me first just thank the Historical Society and Ron for this honor, and just also say I'm just honored to be recognized along with Richard and Erica and Alana. I mean, it's just, they're well deserving of the honor. I'm not sure I am, but I'm glad to be in their company. But, I got started, introduced to the financial service area really back in college. My first summer jobs, I was fortunate to get a job with a bank where I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky. And I started out as a bank teller and did that, got extra money during the summers. And then I'd come home for Christmas break and they needed extra tellers for the holidays. And I made money doing that. And then when I graduated from college, I got a job at the same bank working in the legal department of that bank as a paralegal. I sort of knew I wanted to eventually go to law school. That paralegal job really opened my eyes to how banks are regulated. I got a lot of interesting research projects. And then, of course, I went on to law school. And in law school, my favorite subject, really, or course, was securities regulation. And I had summer jobs when I was in law school, worked for law firms that represented firms in the securities industry. So I got more exposure to the securities industry in particular. And then when I graduated from law school, because of my interest in securities regulation, I applied to the SEC and I was fortunate to get an offer. I got an offer from enforcement. I got an offer from investment management. The enforcement offer was the one that I thought I was going to take, but it was in the regional office that was across the river in Roslyn, which eventually got closed. And I thought it would be better to be in the headquarters office in DC. And so I took the IM job, knowing nothing really about investment management because that wasn't the scope of securities regulation course in my law school. But that set me on the course. I, of course, worked in the investment management division, started out doing exemptive applications, providing exemptions to registrants from the Investment Company Act, Investment Advisors Act. And then I went later into rulemaking and worked on developing rules, stayed at the SEC for 3 years, kind of felt like I had plateaued. I learned a lot very quickly, but when you get bogged down in rulemaking, as everybody knows, the rules can take a long time to work through. And so that's when I made the switch and went into private practice with a law firm, the Deckard firm that specialized in investment management. And so that's kind of, and then of course I did that for 16 years in private practice and then eventually came back. Arthur Levitt hired me to come back as the IM director.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul. Richard, if you don't mind, I want to go to you next. Same question, and I'll just say for context, you started at the SEC in a very different era, and I'm curious what it was like. If I remember correctly, you started in the commission in the late 70s. Tell us a little bit about your path. How did you get to the commission, and where did you start when you got to the SEC?
Sure. I would like to add one thing to what Paul said about the Historical Society's efforts in this regard. And that is, in addition to honoring Commissioner Hunt, providing a platform for us to discuss our experiences at the commission will allow future generations to hear our stories and compare what they're experiencing to what we've experienced in the periods that we've been active at the commission. That said, I did not originally start out intending to work in the financial services area. I was interested in working at the SEC because it was an independent regulatory agency, a great track record. It did its own litigation, both at the district court and appellate levels, and took a role in Supreme Court work also. And that interested me. When I had been in law school, I participated in a law students in court program and represented indigent defendants in court. And so I wanted to continue to litigate, although not in the criminal arena. I thought having a complex civil practice would be very interesting. And so I gravitated towards the commission. In 1980, which was 3 years after I started at the commission, Ralph Farrar became general counsel, and he restructured the office. He created different specialty groups, including adjudication, legal policy, and general lit, which was technically litigation and administrative practice. And so that was like my dream situation. And I spent years in that unit defending the commission and its employees and commissioners when they were sued in the federal courts. Most of those actions were brought by people who were targets of investigations or administrative proceedings, and they were trying to stop the commission's law enforcement efforts. So my job was to go in, fight the TRO, temporary restraining order, or the PI, preliminary injunction, that they were trying to obtain to stop our law enforcement efforts. To me, that was the ideal situation. In fact, in one of my first cases, it was called Hunt versus the SEC. The Hunt brothers, Nelson Bunker and Lamar, who owned the Kansas City Chiefs, tried to corner the silver market, which had implications for the securities markets. And headquarters started an investigation. And they sued us in federal court in Dallas, trying to block our investigation. So I remember flying down there and meeting with a judge about the PI hearing. And the judge said, we're going to get started next week. So everybody take their discovery. So I spent the week in Texas deposing the entire Hunt family, including Nelson Bunker and Lamar, in anticipation of that hearing. So how often does someone who's 3 or 4 years out of law school find themselves in that situation, in a piece of high-powered litigation and a major role in the PI hearing? So after that, I was sold on doing that. But I did become interested in the regulatory programs at the commission over time as I got introduced to the Rule 102E program. And later in my career, that became the focus of much of my work.
Sorry, I had myself on mute. Thank you for that. I just want to point out a couple, already a theme I see between what you shared and what Paul shared around how you got to the SEC. And it resonates with me in that I think for many folks, they start their career at the SEC, don't really know as much about the agency. And I think particularly for communities of color, I didn't have anybody in my family that had any inkling of what the SEC actually was. I think for years, my family thought I worked for the Secret Service as opposed to the Securities Exchange Commission. So anyway, I love that. Erica, how about you? What was your path to the SEC? Oh, and you're on mute.
Am I still on mute?
You're good.
Okay, great. I want to reiterate the thanks to the SEC Historical Society for hosting this, Ron, because this was his brainchild. And I also just feel very honored to be among Paul and Richard. I feel like I'm really not worthy because when I was going up through the SEC, I knew both of them and looked at them with admiration. So it's really an honor to be here today. So my path to financial regulation in the SEC really starts with my grandmother. My grandparents were farmers in rural Alabama, and my grandmother literally kept the savings that she had in her mattress. because she didn't trust the stock market, and she didn't trust banks. And we all know that money under mattresses can't grow. You need to invest it in order to build wealth. And I was really fortunate because my dad, my grandmother's son, was the first person in his family to go to college, and he really took an interest in the markets. He studied all he could about them. He formed an investment club when he was in his 20s to share his knowledge with his friends and community. And when I started working out of law school at a law firm, he made me take my first check and talk to me about how we were going to use it and invest it into the markets. And so after being at that firm for a few years, I decided that I wanted to go into securities enforcement because I could then hold wrongdoers accountable and do my part for helping to build trust in our capital markets. And ultimately, I felt like, the SEC is all about people, and building trust in our markets is all about people, especially in communities of color, where, like my grandmother, there had been a lack of knowledge and trust in the markets.
That's great. Erica, I'm going to stay with you for a second. One of the things that I think is really special about this event, and particularly having you here, is you're in this lofty role as a leader at a really important federal financial services regulator. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, how did you get to that lofty role that you're in right now, other than just being incredibly good at your job, which I'm going to stipulate, we know is a fact?
There are a lot of folks who are very exceptional. And so I'm glad you asked the question. So you mentioned here that I've served as Deputy Chief of Staff for 3 years in the SEC. And I had prior to that been in the enforcement division for 7 years. And my whole focus had been my cases and litigating my cases. But when I had the opportunity to go to the chair's office, I learned about rulemaking. I got to work on examinations. I learned about how to run an organization, and I really learned about leadership and management. And so I had an opportunity to sit at the foot of 3 chairs and learn how they did their work. And I really credit that with how I, in part, got to this position today. But as you mentioned, there are a lot of people who have gained incredible experience. And one of the things that I think has been really instrumental in my advancement through my career is relationships. I always tell people to be kind, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the smart thing to do. And oftentimes there are going to be positions, especially when you get senior in your career, that aren't posted. Well, the PCAOB position was posted, but there may be positions where there are a lot of qualified applicants vying for those positions. And you're going to need someone in your corner who is out there advocating for you and pushing for you to get that role. And honestly, there were a lot of people who were very supportive to me after I applied for this position. There were people who I'd worked alongside at the SEC who called me and encouraged me to apply. The Congressional Black Caucus was very, very helpful to me, and then they wrote a letter to the SEC advocating for me to get this role. There's so many people, really more than I can name, who were very helpful and who advocated for me to get this. And honestly, I'm really grateful to Chair Gensler and the commissioners for not only appointing me a few years ago, but re-appointing me.
That's great. And I can attest you are nice at all times. Very good at your job, but also very nice, which is nice. Paul, how about you? I think there's a lot of mystery for people around the division leaders within the SEC. Can you give us a little bit of an inside baseball story about how you got to be the director for the Division of Investment Management?
Yeah, thank you, Kier. Yeah, coming back to the SEC is my second stint as IM director. It was I got contacted by Arthur Levitt, who was then chair of the commission, and I think he reached out to me because I had been in private practice at the Deckard firm for about 15 years, and during that period, I represented a variety of different firms in the investment management industry. I think built built up a good reputation as someone who knew the SEC, knew the regulations, knew how to navigate those regulations and the commission. And so he reached out to me and had lunch with them. He eventually offered me the job and as IM director, and I turned it down. I turned it down because I had some young sons who I had to pay for college. I was going to take a substantial pay cut. So he was disappointed that I turned the job down. And then 3 or 4 months went by. During that time period, I lost my mother. And that caused me to kind of rethink what I wanted to do, life. And Arthur Levitt came back to me 3 or 4 months later and said, I can't find anybody that I'm comfortable with to take the IM job. Would you reconsider? And I did reconsider. I thought about, what was important. I had majored in government in undergrad. I was always interested in public policy, and I reassessed and thought this was an opportunity to come back and actually help shape policy. When I was at the commission as a young staff attorney, I was just following instructions and doing what I was told to do, even in circumstances where I wasn't necessarily on board with the policy direction. But here was an opportunity to really influence policy and be part of shaping policy. And so I took the job on the second time around and stayed there 6.5 years. So, and it was really one of the best experiences I've ever had. Very trying time at points when I was there over the 6.5 years. As you mentioned, I worked for 3 SEC chairmen. Arthur Levitt, it was a big focus on the mutual fund industry and how we could strengthen the governance framework for the industry. And then Harvey Pitt was director. It was during the time of 9/11. Again, another challenging period, and got the markets up and going. We had to put in some special provisions for the investment company industry so they could operate during that period, challenging period. And then finally with Commissioner Donaldson, another challenging period because you had the late trading and mutual fund market timing scandal, which, to that point, the mutual fund industry had really been unscathed. So again, another challenging period. So over that 6.5 years, I had sort of from calm to storm to storm. So very challenging period, learned a lot. And again, I was just glad I had the opportunity to be in that position and influence policy.
It's fascinating, Paul. You probably wouldn't even remember this. So we overlapped when you were in your role as division director. And as a very junior lawyer, your point around being kind of the calm and the storm, you were always calm. At least, maybe it was the duck with the legs underneath the water.
Yeah, outwardly calm.
But you managed it very well. I never felt like things were going awry, even if the markets were, because you did such a nice job kind of maintaining a demeanor and focus on the prize, which is protecting investors in the markets. All right, Richard, I want to come back to you if we could. If you don't mind, let's shift a little bit. I want to talk about mentors and role models and sponsors, because again, with a career that you've had, that longevity in the commission in such different roles, talk to me a little bit about some of the mentors and sponsors you've had over your career.
Sure. Let me start by telling you about my entry into the commission. I interviewed with the General Counsel's office in 1977, and Harvey Pitt was General Counsel at the time. So when I came in for the interview, they took me to a room, gave me a sheet of paper with a legal question. And asked me to write a response to it. So I wrote a response. They gave it to a secretary, let her type it, let me edit it until I was satisfied with it. And then they assembled a group of supervisors who questioned me about it for about half an hour. I think primarily to make sure that I understood what I was arguing. Afterwards, I must have done okay because I met Harvey Pitt. He had me come by 7:30 on a Friday night for the interview. And afterwards, he offered me the position. But on my first day on the job, I showed up to personnel and went through the process. And I got to my office about 9:15. And then this gentleman walks in with one of those double-decker carts full of boxes. And he said, "Are you Richard Humes?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, here's the record to Cold Shock versus Geico. We need a Supreme Court op cert by Friday morning. Call me if you have any questions." So I did the best that I could. I wrote my draft, and they must have worked with it because it became the basis for the rest of the brief. But I ran to Harvey a week later, and he said, "I had never done that to anybody before, but I wanted to see if you could cut it. So that's why I did it to you. And I think I'm going to do it to everybody from now on." So that's the atmosphere that I found myself in. And I decided I'm going to need some mentors, maybe a couple of mentors. So the first one I had was a gentleman named Jim Bowers, who was an attorney fellow who was in GC for a 2-year stint. And he took me under his wings and helped me get through that first year. Thereafter, Linda Feinberg, who later went to the NASD, became an assistant general counsel, and I was her trial counsel for a couple of years. And she really worked with me to prepare me for more senior positions at the agency. And in fact, when she became the associate general counsel for litigation, she saw to it that I was promoted to the assistant general counsel position. I have to mention Giovanni Prezioso, we lost a couple of years ago. He came in about 2000, and I was already an associate at the time, but he had a totally different perspective on things. And he pushed me beyond just doing the four corners of my job. He wanted me to do other things. He insisted that I get involved in crisis management at the agency. So I started finding that whenever there was a problem that cut across the agency, I had a seat at the table. Then when he had issues come up, like the problem with the whistleblower statute, leaving a lot of room for whistleblowers to have their complaints rejected, he said, "Why don't you take a look at that?" And eventually we started writing amicus briefs supporting whistleblowers. And then, as I think, Kier, you mentioned earlier, the case in the Ninth Circuit, Wu, which dealt with the commission's ability to prevent executives of companies from keeping incentive-based funds where the company was required to restate its financials within the last 180 days. The case was lost at the initial level, and it was going to be heard en banc, and he was scheduled to argue it. And he came to me the week of the argument and said, "Richard, you're going to do this." And of course, I wasn't really prepared, but it was an opportunity. You don't get to have too many en banc arguments, so I accepted it. And I remember going out there, and the whole Los Angeles regional office was there because it was their case. And I think there were 13 judges up there for en banc in the Ninth Circuit, and we won. And the only judge who voted against us was the judge who wrote the panel decision against us. And so I really credit him with pushing me, going beyond just managing general litigation, but also working on projects that cut across the various offices and divisions of the commission.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Richard. Erica, I was thinking I would come to you next. Same question. Tell us about the role that mentors and sponsors at the SEC or otherwise have played in your career.
Sure. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. So I have been very fortunate to have a number of mentors and sponsors throughout my career. And one thing I will say is that I think it took me far too long to realize how important that was. For a really long time, I just thought if I worked really hard and I put my head down, then I would just progress. And honestly, it is important to work hard and put your head down and become excellent, but I don't think it's enough. And I think I might have gone farther faster if I had learned, like really knew that how important it was to get a mentor or sponsor early. Once I learned that lesson, though, I have found mentors and sponsors in every role that I've been in, including my current role. And at the SEC, I will say probably one of the most impactful mentors or sponsors that I had was Mary Shapiro. I was really fortunate to become her enforcement counsel after winning a jury verdict, her office, and she took notice of me. But she also, I feel, just really changed the full trajectory of my career. She promoted me to deputy chief of staff, and I think that was a real game changer in my career. She's still a mentor to this day. And then along the way through the White House, a former White House counsel, Neil Eggleston, is still a mentor. I have mentors from my prior firm. And as I note, I have people who I feel serve as mentors to me even now. So my advice to young attorneys is to seek out mentors wherever you work. And I think that it's important to make sure that people know you do excellent work. You want to make sure that the person you're seeking to mentor you, that you make them look good, that you let them know things that you aspire to do because they can't help you if they don't know where you're trying to go, and that you get to know them on a personal level, not just on a work level. After all, this is a game all about relationships. And so that's my advice for people out there who are looking to seek out mentors and how it has been successful for me over the years.
That's fantastic. And Paul, we'll close this question out with you. Tell us a little bit about your mentors and sponsors.
Yeah, during my first stint as a young staff attorney, I can't really say I had mentors per se. I mean, as a young Black attorney at the SEC coming in 1979, there was only a handful of Black attorneys, and Richard was one of them. And Richard may not know this, but I looked to him. I observed how Richard carried himself, how I'd see him in meetings, how professional and competent he was. And I said to myself, I want to be like Richard. Great lawyer, great person, and well respected within the agency. And so he was kind of my goal as a young staff attorney. I had good bosses. A guy named Howie Halleck was my first supervisor, and Harvard Law School graduate, very smart. Made sure that the work product that we produced was excellent. Later worked for Art Brown in rulemaking, another really good lawyer. But we had good leadership in the commission. Sid Mendelson was the director, and I remember going in on the first day as a SEC staff attorney in investment management, and got to sit down with Sid. And I told him, I said, Mr. Mendelson, I've read the Investment Company Act and I've read the Investment Advisors Act, and I'm ready to go to work. And he looked at me and he said, well, did you understand any of it? And I said, honestly, there's a lot of it I just couldn't understand. He said, don't worry about it. It will come to you over time. But great director, listened, learned. Joel Goldberg was associate director, Marty Liebecker, another associate director. So I just listened and learned from them. And then as I mentioned, I stayed 3 years, and then I went to the Deckard Law Firm, where there were two former SEC staffers there, Alan Mostoff, who had been former division director, and Paul Haga had been a staff attorney at the SEC, and I worked very closely with them. And quite frankly, that's how I learned how to practice law and really to be a lawyer. The SEC, you're really focused on, narrow things that you're assigned, but I had broad ranging responsibilities working with diverse clients, diverse issues, challenging projects. Like there used to be a firm called E.F. Hutton, if anybody remembers them, broker dealer. They got in trouble with check kiting and.
But still one of the most effective slogans in the world. That's just,
Yeah,
we just have to acknowledge that.
Right. Wire fraud. And they had to have an overseer. And I spent a big chunk of 1 year just trying to get E.F. Hutton's investment management operations back on track and compliant with the federal securities law. So really good learning experience. But I'd say that Alan Mostoff, Paul Haga, great mentors. And then when I came back as IM director, Ike Hunt, who had been an investment management lawyer, it's called corporate regulation or something then, but he was very supportive, always willing to give me time. Arthur Levitt and all the chairmen I worked for were very supportive. Harvey Goldschmidt was general counsel, just a real gentleman and good to work with. Later became a commissioner. David Becker, general counsel later, and then Giovanni, as Richard mentioned. You have to have a good working relationship with the general counsel's office because they can put the kibosh on what you want to do, say you don't have authority, etc. So working with them was great. I think everybody said it, that you can't beat the SEC in terms of culture and support. And I was just privileged to be a part of it.
Thank you, Paul.
Here-
Erica, I was gonna come back to you, Erica. Anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing because I think it's a through line from what Paul and Richard both said, and that is your mentor doesn't need to look like you. And oftentimes, if you're waiting around for that, you're going to be waiting a long time. And so for all of us, we had people who were very different from ourselves, at least, just on superficial level, who are mentors and who made real differences in our careers. And I encourage, again, young attorneys who are out there not to limit yourself, because there are lots of, folks who really want to mentor you and can serve as wonderful mentors. And I've been the beneficiary of that throughout my career.
You took the words literally out of my mouth, and I just want to add to that with my own mentorship example. When people talk to me about, my career and the highlights, one of the big highlights for me is around the mentors that I've had, both of whom came from the SEC, by the way. One of them was Marty Dunn, who was a division director in CorpFin, and literally there was something, and at the time he was an associate director, there's something that he said that I have never forgotten, which is, when he was a young lawyer, he would take the metro back and forth to the SEC back when we were at 450 East 5th Street. And what he shared was that he would read something every night. He would take a memo home every night and try to memorize it so that if he ever got a question about that, he was one of the few people. And it's so funny how that practice has still stuck with me. Even right now in my current role, if I'm on a long flight, long train ride, I try to take something that I have never read before that's federal securities law or financial markets related and read it going home and coming back. And that's just the kind of impact that a mentor can have. Similarly, other mentor, David Martin, currently at Covington and Burling, and had been a division director when I was at the SEC. Same thing. And I literally would not be in this seat right now if it weren't for the two of them taking an interest in me. And so I just want to underscore what you just said, Erica, and I'll add something to that, which is your comment was to the potential mentees saying your mentor doesn't have to look like you. I would also like to remind people, the potential mentors out there, that look for mentees who may not look like you, because you may find, as you said, you have much more in common than superficial things may otherwise tell you. And you can make a huge impact in someone's life by choosing a mentee, particularly one who may have come from underserved community, whether they look like you or not. So I love that comment, Erica. Thank you so much for making it. And by the way, thank you for all the mentors that have been mentioned on this call. I want to stick with this theme around your mentor and your mentee may not look like you. And let's talk a little bit about the role that race has played in your careers. And, this is something we talked about in the prep call. When you think about being the first or one of four, Erica, or Paul, for you, one of three, I believe at this point, for division directors, not a lot of cohorts. Richard, I think about your tenure. How many African Americans have had that kind of tenure at the SEC that you've had? And so I'd love to talk about the role that race has played, positively or negatively, in your careers over the course of your time. And Richard, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure. I've had a very fortunate experience in that my experience at the commission has been mostly positive. I applied for a number of positions and was chosen. I was offered other positions that were prestigious that I turned down for personal reasons. So I don't have a lot of complaints about my experiences at the commission. I've had some bad experiences outside of the commission while representing the agency. For example, there was a broker-dealer that sued the commission in state court, arguing that it couldn't be disciplined by the commission because the New Jersey Constitution protected it from the securities laws. And so I went into court to argue that case, and the judge, he had a cigar in his hand and he paced back and forth. And in the middle of the argument, he said, "Stop, Mr. Humes." He said, "It's 1915 in Mississippi, and a black man goes to vote, and he handed him a piece of paper that says, 'Blacks ain't voting here today,'" which of course had nothing to do with the argument. It was just an effort on his part to either embarrass me or to prompt me to say something that will allow him to hold me in contempt. And in subsequent proceedings, he engaged in similar kind of conduct, I think for the same reason. So I don't know how many commission attorneys have had those kinds of experiences, but it's negative. Now, in participating in panels and meetings with people from the industry and from law firms, I have never had anything inappropriate said to me like the things that were said in that courtroom. And part of it may be they were accustomed to seeing people like Alana Peters and Isaac Hunt, and they were not prepared to go down that path of lobbying insults.
That's great. Erica, how about you?
So I agree with Richard, and we talked about this before this call. I didn't experience while I was at the commission anything that I would have considered at the time to be racism. I just felt like people were very supportive. And I used to always say any stress I get from this job comes from opposing counsel and the court, which is, where it's supposed to come from. I found that people were very supportive within the organization. I will say that I did note that there weren't as many senior level people of color. And that was something that I know the chairs that I work for were really very much trying to fix. I remember seeing Paul for the first time. I'd been at the commission for a very short period of time, and they had an enforcement retreat. And I remember just standing there staring like, oh my God, there's a division director who's Black. Like Paul, I used to see Richard in the hallways. And for a while, I was scared of you, Richard. You were so professional and very, I was like, I don't know what his role is, but he's very, very important. And I too aspire to be like you. I do think that that has an impact on the staff. I remember when I was leaving the commission, I got a very, very kind email from a staff member in CorpFin that said, "Thank you for showing us what's possible." And I get choked up thinking about that now. That was so nice for her to say, and not something that at the time I was, I even contemplated. I was kind of just doing my job. But I do realize in the role that I'm in now that it has an impact. I wanted to go to law school because I liked LA law and I saw Blair Underwood on there and I wanted to be like him. And that was, representation very much matters. And I do think that we all have shared experiences, we have life experiences, we have perspectives that we can bring, especially to the financial regulatory field, that are critically important, and that financial regulators should look like the people that they are representing. And that's really important to me. So, as the first woman and first person of color at the PCAOB, I think that's important, but I really feel it's more important that I'm not the last one.
I love that, Erica, and you are a role model. And I'm sure that there are people at the PCAOB and frankly in this industry now who are looking at you as I am married to an auditor, a former SEC accountant. And when I look within the auditor community, there aren't as many folks of color as there should be. And so it really is wonderful to see you in that role, doing an excellent job, by the way, coming back to what something you said earlier.
I appreciate it. And I'll tell you, when I meet with the leadership of the major accounting firms, I always ask them, what are they doing to retain and promote people of color?
Yeah, that's great. Paul, how about you? Tell us about what role, if any, race has played in your
I really concur with Richard and Erica. I had 2 stints at the SEC. As a young staff attorney, I didn't encounter any racial issues when I was there. When I came back as IM director, the discomforting situations were really more with people from the outside coming into the commission, meeting with us. And I recall one particular situation where it was a big company wanted to meet with the staff, large group of staff members. They wanted some exemptions to operate a new product under the Investment Company Act. And so they were making their presentation. I had come from another meeting to this meeting. The staff had saved a space for me at the head of the table because I was the IM director. And they commenced their presentation. And the whole time, I was the only Black person in the room. The whole time they directed their presentation to all the white folks in the room. And then they got through their presentation, and the lead person, Wall Street lawyer, said, "Well, what do you think about giving us the exemptions?" And one of the staff members said, "Well, you have to ask the division director who's down at the other end of the table, who they never looked at in terms of the presentation." So it was just kind of those little disses, if you will, that you picked up on. But it was more when I was in private practice at a law firm, and you would be introduced to a new client taking on the projects, and you could always, at times, you could detect some reluctance of them wanting to deal with you as a Black attorney, and you felt additional pressure to show them that you were competent, that you knew what you were doing. And then when you would get to work with them and you'd get the result that they wanted, it was always gratifying that they came back and said, "Well, we want Paul to work on our next project." But there was always that initial, "Hey, wait a minute, we're not sure that this Black guy can do the job for us." And I never had any situations where there was overt racism where a client said, "Well, we don't want him on our matter." But there was always, you had to overcome kind of the initial perception issue that maybe you're not as competent as a white lawyer to handle their matters. So again, it was more when I was outside the commission that I had to confront those kinds of issues, but not at the commission itself.
Very much aligns with my experience as well. I think as we were preparing for this session, we had a really, I think, lively discussion around some of the more significant matters that each of you have worked on. And if you don't mind, I'd love to pivot to that. And Erica, maybe I'll start with you. Can you say a word about, what was among, if not the most significant work that you did at the commission? You have the privilege, Madam Chair, of choosing your time at the SEC or your time at the PCAOB.
I mean, that's hard, especially considering my work at both of the organizations. I will say this, I've been thinking about that because I knew you were going to ask me that question. And what I think was probably most impactful was the work I did in enforcement. And I can think of one particular matter where there was a large Ponzi scheme, and people were literally swindled out of their life savings. And we had done that case in conjunction with the Department of Justice. And I remember literally spending hours on the phone with people who had looked up the complaint, who had been swindled, calling me and asking me, how could I get their money back because they needed money for their cancer medication. This was all they'd saved up for retirement. And I carry those stories with me. That individual ended up getting, I think it was 25 to 30 years in prison. And, when I think about like some of the most impactful work, there have been a lot of things that I worked on at the commission that were important to investors, and every day we're working for investors at the PCAOB. But when it comes down to it, again, everything we do is about people, and hearing those stories and knowing that you're going to work every day to help people save for their retirement and save for their kids to go through college, and the work that you really do makes a difference. That's what I think was probably my most impactful work.
I love that you said people. I just say I have to move for a second. You didn't know this, but behind me, I lead legal and compliance. People, right? That's who we ultimately serve in all of our roles, including our roles now. Paul, let me go to you next. Tell me about what would be the most significant matter that you've worked on in your time at the SEC.
Yeah, I can mention a couple. One would be I got called into Harvey Pitt's office, who was chairman of the SEC at the time. And he said, I think that the mutual fund industry should be self-regulated like broker dealers. And I think we ought to create something like a FINRA for the mutual fund industry. And I was kind of blown away that he was thinking that we had the authority to create a self-regulatory organization for the mutual fund industry. And so I said, well, let me go back and, analyze it, think about it. And I came back to him and I said, Harvey, I really don't think we have the authority to do that. I said, but I have another idea for you. I think we could propose and adopt, the commission could propose and adopt a rule that would, and he was concerned about, oversight of the industry and enhancing standards. And I said, we could create a requirement that each mutual fund and investment advisors for that matter could have a chief compliance officer whose job was to make sure that the firms were complying with the federal securities laws. We could require them to have comprehensive policies and procedures and administer those. And so we moved forward. We proposed the CCO rule, compliance policies and procedures, and created a lot of jobs for chief compliance officers. But, it's one of those rules that you can never know what problems got avoided because firms had to have compliance policies and procedures. They had a CCO to monitor for compliance, reporting to mutual fund boards of directors about the effectiveness of those compliance policies and procedures. And so I think consequently, it was a real, and then it got copied in other parts of the securities industry, and people started requiring chief compliance officers. So So I think that was the most significant. And then the second thing I would just quickly mention would be the response that we put in place to the late trading and market timing scandal for the mutual fund industry. There was legislation that was being talked about on the Hill that was really going to be draconian, have adverse effects on the industry. With Chairman Donaldson, we put in place an action plan, did a fair amount of rulemaking, and headed off really draconian legislation that probably would have really done harm to the industry and investors. So those would be the two I'd mention.
Those are impactful. All right, Richard, top that. Just kidding. Tell us about your.
I don't know that I can top that, but I've got an example or two.
Yeah.
One was implementation of the up the ladder reporting rules in SOX. While that was a Herculean effort to get the rule done in the 180 days that Congress allowed, knowing that the bar had been fighting over such a rule for 3 decades, but we got it done. But the most important thing was the push that we made after the rule was promulgated. Giovanni and I sat down and talked about how to get people complying and came to the conclusion that I should get out on the road, as he said, be the face of the commission, go to every single bar meeting, corporate meeting, law firm meetings, and explain how the rule works and what lawyers should do. And I did that for about 1.5 years. Every couple of weeks, I was out on the road at a conference explaining what to do. And I found over time that law firms were creating internal committees so that associates who came across evidence didn't have to take on the burden of reporting. They would send it to the internal committee. And companies were establishing whistleblower offices for the same purpose. Now, I can't quantify how many frauds were stopped because lawyers reported up the ladder to the highest offices at their clients, but I've got to think it helped a lot. The other area was the Supreme Court case, Credit Suisse versus Bowling. This was an antitrust case that came out of the Second Circuit. And the plaintiffs in the case were alleging that investment bankers, by having tying agreements and pricing agreements in IPO syndications, were violating antitrust laws. So the general counsel at the time was Brian, and he called me in and said, Richard, this is going to the Supreme Court. You have to handle it. I said, well, I don't have any experience with antitrust law at all. He says, you've got to do it. I'm going to give you people who have some experience, but you have to go lead our effort before the SG. So I really didn't understand what was wrong at the time until I read the briefs. And then I realized that while the SEC had filed a brief in the Second Circuit arguing that the federal securities laws impliedly preempted the antitrust laws, the Solicitor General had authorized antitrust and civil to file a brief saying that IPOs are subject to the antitrust laws. So that meant we had to move the SG, in order to win that case. So we put together a team. Jamie Bergagliano, who at one time was the acting director of trading and markets, people from CorpFin, commissioners, we all went over to the SG's office armed and made a number of presentations. And I know there had to have been other forces at work. There were too many interests in the outcome of this case, the investment bankers. But the bottom line was that the SG decided to support our position that the IPO syndication process should not be subject to antitrust laws. And we won 8-1, in the Supreme Court. And I can imagine the disastrous effect it would have had on the IPO process if people had to get approval from the commission and then go get antitrust approval, which probably would not be available because the techniques that they used were antithetical.
So, okay, you did give Paul and Erica a run for their money on that one. Arguing before the Supreme Court is pretty cool. That's pretty great. I was going to shift to talk a little bit about financial literacy, and this one maybe is a grab bag for who may want to take it first. You know, I mentioned earlier the dearth of regulators who come from communities of color in the financial services industry. And, you know, as I mentioned with the Freedmen's Bureau, pretty significant implications for all communities, but certainly including communities of color. One of the issues that I think is really pervasive is the need for more financial literacy education, literally for all Americans, not just communities of color. I'd love to talk about that. And I don't know who might want to go first, but I'd love it if anyone has a perspective on the importance of financial literacy for all communities, but again, including communities of color.
I'll start if I may. I think it's critically important. I think the Office of Investor Education and Advocacy at the SEC does a wonderful job. I remember as a result of Dodd-Frank, there was a financial literacy study, and they came out with a list of the top 5 or 6 communities that had lower financial literacy scores. And of course, African Americans was among that list, as were, you know, the military and seniors and young people. And one of the chairs that I work for, Mary Jo White, made it a point to do in-person programs for each of the communities that were listed in that study. I will say that I think that it's something that schools should take on. I think that that's very difficult for us at the PCAOB. One of the things that we are trying to do is just to get the word out there through media that people pay attention to now. So through LinkedIn and other social media, we have videos on what is an audit, what is the PCAOB, very basic things to try to make sure that we're doing our part to inform investors about why this is important. But I agree with you, Kier, more can be done.
Richard, Paul, anything
Can
you
I
want
jump
to add?
in?
Oh, please.
I don't have much expertise in this area, but when I looked at the question, it made me think about approaching youth, about learning about financial literacy before they grow up and start taking on debts, learning about the terminology, saving money, investing money, not taking on unsustainable debt at a young age would be a positive development. There has to be information on the internet, podcasts, websites. There has to be information out there that can assist them. And to get them started at a young age, learning about investments and the terminology would certainly be a positive development.
Yeah, this is something that I'm very interested in, and I would just mention a couple of things. One is I serve on the SEC's Investor Advisory Committee, and we just put out a recommendation to the Commission on financial literacy and financial education. And I would urge folks to go look at that recommendation. As Erica mentioned, the Investor Education Office at the SEC, I think, is really understaffed. They have 45 people assigned to that group, and 41 of them are responding to complaints and issues raised by investors. There's 4 staffers who are focused on investor education. So it really would be good at somehow Congress would fund that to a greater extent. The recommendation also notes that there are only 25 states. There are half the states that don't mandate any kind of personal financial education. And if you look at the states that do have it and don't have it, the ones that don't have it, if you look at the demographics, they're in states where you have sizable minority populations. So those underserved communities, the kids at the high school level aren't getting any kind of financial education. And so we're recommending, at least our committee recommended, that there be financial incentives provided to the states to encourage training of teachers, more programs, in the school systems for that. And we also had some pretty novel ideas. We look for ways, we suggested ways that the SEC could promote investor.gov more broadly, including the SEC getting its own influencers to promote investor.gov and educational materials. If these finfluencers can promote cryptocurrencies and gambling websites, can't we get some responsible celebrities, athletes to promote investor education? And so you'll see some ideas in there like that. The other thing I would mention, Kier, is that I'm also on the FINRA Investor Education Foundation board, and we put out a study on investors of color, and had some things that I think a lot of people are aware of. That the good news is that more and more investors of color are looking to the securities markets and investing. There are more minority investors who are looking to invest than white investors, the growth area. But unfortunately, they're getting much of their information from social media and finfluencers, not relying on traditional sources of financial advice. And of course, going to the internet, social media, there's good information, there's bad information. It's a place for scammers. And we just had a panel on that whole issue and looking to maybe provide some recommendations to the commission on how they should get their arms around these finfluencers, particularly those who are offering inappropriate advice or engage in fraudulent activity.
Thank you, Paul. I want to double down on a couple of points you made. Financial education is actually something that's really important to me, but also very important to Edward Jones. We did a study last year, and I think the study is interesting and aligns exactly with what you just shared a moment ago, Paul. This study last year wasn't just us, it was also with Morning Consult, found that only 20% of respondents reported having learned about financial education in school, while at the same time, 96% of Americans, nearly 100%, feel that basic financial education should be taught. Also found that 28% of respondents said that they lack confidence in their financial knowledge as adults, while roughly 60% said that they would be more confident in their financial situation with a better understanding of debt management. So it's just right aligned with what you were just talking about. We've made a commitment, and it's very aligned with what you were describing, to having 1 million financial learners. And so far, we're about 848,000, so we're making progress. But I think the work of the organizations that you were just describing, along with some of the initiatives, I'd love to get more influencers encouraging people to look at investor.gov and similar kinds of websites. So I think that's really a wonderful point.
Hey, Kira, if I could just make a plug for the SEC Alumni Association.
Oh, of course.
I think, as you know, the SEC Alumni Association has entered into a partnership with the SIFMA Foundation.
Right.
And the SIFMA Foundation runs a stock market game for students. They have a number of programs, investor education type programs. And SEC alumni can now volunteer to go into schools, work in those programs, and help them with financial education for, there are teachers who request people to come in and talk from every level, from elementary school to high school. And so anybody who's an SEC alumni, go to the SIFMA Foundation website, go to the SEC Alumni Association website, and look for those opportunities.
That's great. Thank you, Paul. Thank you for mentioning that. Okay, we're getting close to time, so I'm going to ask just 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap. The first one is, I just feel like it's really appropriate in the context of this inaugural event to reflect on the legacy of Isaac Hunt. And so I'd ask that anyone, and maybe Richard, I'll start with you, any memories or reflections that you have on the legacy of Ike Hunt or Alana Peters, another one of our honorees.
Sure. Now, when you ask about Alana Peters, you're taking me back about 40 years. But I do have a very clear recollection of working with her. I don't recall any particular cases, but I remember being in meetings with her. And the thing you would always take away was her style. She was the most gracious and eloquent commissioner. And she was always supportive of the staff. I don't mean by that she always approved their recommendation, but she supported their efforts. She appreciated their efforts, even if she were going to vote against the position that they were advocating. So I had nothing but positive memories of her. And she and I would speak in the halls from time to time. She would inquire as to how things were going with me. How did I feel about what I was doing? And I had good things to report, but it was good to have a commissioner stopping and asking you those kinds of questions. With respect to Commissioner Hunt, that was much more contemporary, and I do have recollections of working with him in several different contexts. One was SEC Speaks. He was a big guy on attorney ethics. And so each year we would do the ethics panel. I would be there presenting the Rule 102E program and the accounting and attorney cases that we had brought. And then he would get to question us about those cases. And even though he probably supported them, he always probed to make sure that we had adequate justification for bringing the case and that we were bringing the cases for the message that they presented to the bar or to the accounting profession, not just to put another scalp on our polls. Also, he did sit in consideration of a number of recommendations that GC made over the years. I remember his support for us to take the Zanford case to the Supreme Court. It was the case where the Fourth Circuit ruled that a broker who had sold his client's securities so he could steal the money did not violate 10B. And they said, oh, it's just stealing. It's not a 10B5 violation. So he supported us, and we took it up and had a 9-0 victory. But he was very supportive of the staff on that one.
Great. Thank you, Richard. Let's go. Paul, how about you next?
Yeah, I did not overlap with Commissioner Peters, but she became a commissioner after I left on my first stint at the SEC. And I just remember just being proud that there was a Black woman commissioner, first Black commissioner. And as Richard pointed out, just how she carried herself. She knew what she was doing. She was competent. And as a Black man, I was just proud to, see her in that position. And just glad to see her in a position. So from my standpoint, it was more pride just in the job that she was doing in the position that she was in. Now, I overlap with Commissioner Hunt, and he took a particular interest in what I was doing because he had been an investment management lawyer at the staff. And so his door was always open. We had great discussions. He was always there if I needed to bounce something off of him. He just was fun to be around, engaging. And he was very supportive. We didn't always agree on everything, but I just appreciated his support and the knowledge that he and interest that he particularly brought to my particular area.
That's great. All right, Chair Williams, please bring us home.
Erica. So I didn't have the privilege of meeting Commissioner Hunt, I did have the privilege of meeting Commissioner Peters. And I remember she came for a particular speaking engagement when I was, you might hear my son in the background, when I was deputy chief of staff. And what I recall is going up to speak to her after she made her remarks. And I have to admit, I was a complete fangirl when I went up to speak to her because I'd read about her and Commissioner Hunt, and we hadn't had anyone who was Black who had been a commissioner since. And she was so gracious and patient and willing to share her advice and experience, everything that Richard said with respect to how she carried herself. I also, Paul, was very proud that she was the first Black commissioner at the SEC. And I think that all of us, can owe her a debt of gratitude for how excellent she was, because we're all following her footsteps as well as Commissioner Hunt's.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Erica. I appreciate that. Okay, that was a lot of fun. We are at time. So first, I'm going to thank each of you. Then I'm going to turn it back to Ron, Chair Williams, Paul, Richard. Thank you all so much for the time and commentary today. It's been fantastic. And by the way, I also want to thank Ron Long. This was his brainchild. And so, Ron, as you're coming back on in a moment, I just want to thank you for coming up with this idea, helping us come up with this fantastic panel of honorees and putting this whole program together. So, Ron, thank you. And thank you for the privilege of letting me moderate this august group.
Thank you, Kier, and thank you all three honorees, Richard, Chair Williams, and Paul. And in all honesty, this is much more than I could have ever expected. To have that full fabric of the SEC history shown through these three individuals and the stories that they shared, both of Icon and Alana Peters. But more importantly, it gives me a different perspective on a Mary Shapiro or Marty Lydecker and various names that were mentioned, which again goes back to the point of having this entire hall. It's a full history of the SEC, and the Historical Society owns that role to make sure we see the entire picture. So thanks for mentioning me, Kier, and thanking me for leading this, but I put some money in, and I would hope that others don't have to put in what I put in. Ideally, they'll put in much, much more. But if you want to put in less, we'll take that too. So we should be seeing a barcode coming up on the screen, or you can go to our website and just consider donating, because what we really like to do is build on this, have this be live next year. And the other key part we would ask from you and we need is to give us the nominees for next year's honorees. We want 2 to 4 people every year, and we want to have this same sort of program. And if we can do it live, we can also meet afterwards and just enjoy the presentation. So with that, I want to thank everyone and thank you for your time today, and give generously. Goodbye.